Hi everyone, this is a video to talk you through the key quotations for Mrs. Sens. Now we know the story is about a young boy called Elliot whose mother has decided to find him a new childminder. He is an American boy and his mother finds a Indian lady whose husband has come to their local area in America to teach at the local university. It's a seaside town, can't remember exactly where, but that's why there are references to fish, and fish is symbolic throughout the story. And I've tried to pick 5 important quotations that I think are best to help you streamline your revision. So let's start with the first one. She cooked as though she were performing a duty that had been thrust upon her. Now, Mrs. Sen is totally like a fish out of water where she's living now. She's not used to living in a small apartment in America. She's very much used to the culture, a large house. It seems like her husband was somebody who earned quite a bit of money. That's referenced in their chauffeur. And you'll notice my third quotation is about her driving, because she has to learn how to drive in America. The money goes less far in America, and so she is essentially totally living a different life here with her husband. So she cooked as though she were performing a duty that had been thrust upon her. Elliot likes to observe her cooking, and the word thrust makes it sound a lot like she has been forced to do this. And he's a young boy, but he's noticed it. Performing, is this more of a wider metaphor for how she's now having to live a performance that is unnatural to her? So the act of her cooking is not only unnatural because she's not used to it, but it's also a symbol of the wider circumstance that she is in. Next quotation then. There were days, of course, when the fish slipped from her hands and leapt to the floor. Now, again, I've chosen this quotation because it feels like it could be symbolic of a wider message. The fish slipped from her hands. This is her cooking, preparing food for herself and Mr. Sen. But of course, it could be a reflection on her trying her best to grip onto her current life, but it's slipping and leaping away from her. It's a struggle, a symbol of her own struggle to keep going. Sorry, that is a T. Okay. And the tone kind of makes it sound a bit like, yeah, that would happen. There were days, of course, when the fish would slip from her hands. Although the narrator is a third-person narrator, it does often feel like the story is told through the lens of Elliot, who is a young boy but is quite mature, seems to be quite observant for his age. So you'll know, if you know the story, that one of the things her husband encouraged her to do to get out of the house and to get into the culture of America was to drive, but she really struggled with it. Driving was an expression of her freedom, her control over her own destiny. And she feels quite stuck and trapped. And so that driving could be a symbol of her getting out, her freedom. This is what the quotation suggests. But if you know the story, you'll know that her driving actually ends tragically. And she doesn't end up being a safe driver in America. Is there a wider message there about how difficult it is with a culture clash? So is Mrs. Sen sadly destined to not have control over her own destiny in this situation? That feels a little bit sombre, but perhaps it is the truth in this instance. Now, Elliot listens to her stories, and this is another quotation here. She talked about Calcutta, which is where she's from, in India, as though it were next door. So this simile makes it very clear how much Mrs. Sen believes and feels like she's still living that life, or she'd like to be, as though it were next door, not halfway around the world. And I also think the writer is talking, and this says neighbourhood, but I haven't zoomed out enough for you to see it, is referencing how close the neighbourhood is And the life that she talks about there is reflected in that simile, in that she's very close, or was very close, to her sisters, her neighbours, and the way that she sees Calcutta is similar to the way that life was like in Calcutta. And again, Eliot notices that she talks about it as though it was not halfway around the world, but actually next door, just like life was like that for her and her neighbourhood there. And finally, I chose this final quotation to highlight how close Eliot and Mrs. Sens' bond becomes. You'll know by the end of the story, because of the car accident, Eliot is no longer able to stay with Mrs. Sen, who I think he really respects and likes through all of this observance that he shows around her, through all of the careful appreciation of her cultural choices and behaviours. He notices here her face was flushed and she was breathing heavily. She was upset. This is at the end of the story when they come back as a final thing to know that Eliot's not coming back to the household, will not go back to her for childminding. Her face was flushed and she had been breathing heavily. So it's obvious that she's quite upset. But Eliot knows that she hadn't been crying. Is that because she's a symbol of strength to him? Of detachment? Of control? Or is it a child's view that he kind of hopes that she hasn't been crying? We are left at the end of the story wondering what will happen with Mrs. Sen. Will she get that connection that she wants? She is quite obviously lonely. And that's perhaps why she's flushed and breathing heavily, because now she knows that no longer will she have Eliot and that routine that she had after school with him, where he watched her cook. It's no longer going to happen because of that accident that she had whilst driving, she knows that Eliot's mum will not allow him to come back here because of the danger that she might put her son in again. So again, a little bit of a sad story ending, but I'm hoping that those 5 quotations will help you to streamline your revision. Again, my suggestion would be to take each one and pick out words and phrases that you think you could dual code, so draw a picture to support your memory of them, and pick out important parts that would encourage you not to remember the whole thing, but to not over focus on the whole thing. So thrust and performing. Fish, what symbol might you have for freedom that you could look at? Neighbourhood, what might that look like? And the flushed face, and that phrase, knew she hadn't. Best of luck.